marijuana possession, all the amounts was different. The slide doesn't make that clear. The amount is different from marijuana. So what this does, right, is create really, really harsh sentences, right? What was happening before 1973 was nowhere near 15 years to life, right? This is what second-degree murderers were getting. So it was this hugely punitive drug laws that were passed, right, in, I believe at the time, the most populous state, or maybe California was already bigger, but one of the most populous states in the country, and one of the most racially diverse. So it's slightly modified in 1979, where they pulled back on the marijuana sentences a bit. But they set a stage, right? So they're emerging, right? Remember in 1973, we're in Nixon's president, right? This is well into this law and order, anti-drug sort of movement that begins at the end of the 60s, right? So this is one of the first really tangible, severe instantiations of this at the state level. This gets repeated all across the country. In New York, one of the things that happens is that in the course of, 21 years, right, the percentage of New York inmates who are drug offenders goes from 11% to 35%. So it's a huge increase. Now, it's important to remember, right, this doesn't explain the entirety of the increase in New York's or the United States prison population over this time. There's a lot of people who sort of go to the war on drugs as the answer, but it alone doesn't explain everything that happens, which is why we cover so many different topics in this class. But it accounts for a lot of it, right? We go up to 35%, over a third of the people in prison in New York State by the mid-90s are in there for drug-related charges. 16% of the history of violence, so that's 16% of the ones who are in for drug offenses, so a small percentage, relatively speaking. At a certain point in the 2000s, I forget when exactly Patterson was governor, he wasn't governor very long, he describes this as one of the most unsuccessful criminal justice strategies that there's ever been. So by this point, by the 2000s, there's pretty widespread acknowledgement that this is wrong, that something needs to happen. So what happens, 2004, mind you, this is 30 years after they're first established, right? So 15 years to life. There are people, right, who were sentenced in the mid-70s who in 2004 are still in there for these drug charges. They're still in prison. 30 years is a long time, but people are still in there. So they modify it. They change it from 15 years to life to 18 to 20 years. And in 2009, they removed the mandatory minimums and opened it back up to judicial discretion. Right? So all of a sudden now, judges in New York can sentence drug offenders to treatment rather than prison. Right? So huge changes in a complete about-face to an earlier strategy for criminal justice. These moves are part of what explains, right, if you remember back to the different charts that were comparing crime rates and prison populations in different states. New York is one that has managed to reduce its prison population and its crime rate at the same time. One of the ways that New York has reduced its prison population has been through changes like this to their sentencing policies and their laws. One of the things that's important about this, I think I mentioned this before, when these mandatory minimums were gotten rid of, right, you have a whole generation of people who are in prison under these charges, serving 15 years to life. One of the things that happens is New York is faced with the prospect of a lot of these people being released all at once. So what they do is they set up a mechanism for people to appeal individually to have their case heard, to decide whether or not they qualify to be released based on their behavior, how they've been in prison, et cetera, what the extenuating circumstances were. And so there's a very controlled release of people who have been sentenced under the Rockefeller drug laws is still going on. People who were sentenced in the 90s for drug possession in New York are still there, sort of waiting for their appeals to be heard, to be released under this new, these new changes. So about a decade later, a little more than a decade after the Rockefeller drug laws are passed, we have what we've already talked about in this class a couple times, the federal laws under Reagan that create mandatory minimums for crack and powder cocaine possession. These are very well known, much talked about because of the discrepancy here that I have for you between 5 grams of crack cocaine or 50 grams of, or 500 grams of powder cocaine, right? Each triggers a 5-year minimum sentence. A 10-year minimum sentence is triggered for 50 grams of crack or 5,000 grams of powder cocaine. So this comes about, this discrepancy, because of one of these public hysterias or public panics over drugs, right? It's similar to, right, you have in Doris Marie Provine's chapter, right, a description of several examples of this historically. The opium scare at the turn of the century, concern over cocaine in the 1930s, concerns over marijuana, later concerns over heroin after World War II. This is a similar one where there's a number of high-profile, highly publicized overdoses of celebrities. Or actually, I can only remember one at the moment, who's a basketball player, from cocaine. And then there's a sort of reorganization of drug turf in many of the urban centers of the U.S., which result in increased violence, urban violence, right? Part of what the media and politicians do is they scapegoat crack cocaine for that violence. And so in a very similar pattern to the ones that Provine describes, you have these accounts of crack cocaine causing people to be murderously violent. There's also a new sort of layer of it, which is looking at crack cocaine as a health epidemic, particularly around newborn children. And so I talked about this a little bit before. I want to show you a video from the New York Times on this.
It is a problem in Houston, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Tucson, and Sacramento. In the 1980s, the media sounded the alarm that a new drug, crack cocaine, was taking over American cities and that it had an especially devastating effect on pregnant women and their newborns.
A new study says that babies born to women who use cocaine during pregnancy are 3 times as likely to be born with birth defects.
They tend to be what we call jittery.
They're very, very high risk for cerebral palsy, mental retardation.
They are prone to hypertension, strokes, and sudden infant death syndrome.
These children, who are the most expensive babies ever born in America, are going to overwhelm every social service delivery system that they come in contact with throughout the rest of their lives.
Drugs take away the dream from every child's heart and replace it with a nightmare.
Thank you, Nancy. Madam First Lady.
Yes, you can see that's not the end. It does not appear to be buffering. Reload the page. Now we can add. Do I do it? give it one more try and just talk it through. By Acura.
There was another warning about cocaine today.
Crack now has spread to almost every American city.
It is a problem in Houston, Philadelphia, Kansas City, Tucson, and Sacramento. In the 1980s, the media sounded the alarm that a new drug, crack cocaine, was taking over American cities and that it had an especially devastating effect on pregnant women and their newborns.
A new study says that babies born to women who use cocaine during pregnancy are 3 times as likely to be born with birth defects.
They tend to be what we call jittery.
They're very, very high risk for cerebral palsy, mental retardation.
They are prone to hypertension, strokes, and sudden infant death syndrome.
These children, who are the most expensive babies ever born in America, are going to overwhelm every social service delivery system that they come in contact with throughout the rest of their lives.
Drugs take away the dream from every child's heart and replace it with a nightmare.
But were these infants really doomed? Nearly 3 decades later, what is the true legacy of the crack baby era? In the early 1980s, Dr. Ira Chasnoff, a young researcher at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, decided to study what he saw as a worrisome trend among his pregnant patients who had used cocaine.
Women were coming in and their babies were looking different when they were born. They had higher rates of prematurity and they had higher rates of newborn seizures and other complications.
A lot of the babies exposed to cocaine are quite small. Do you think that's related to the use of the drug during pregnancy?
We'd seen effects of alcohol and other substances on children, so we were certainly open to the idea that this was a problem. Cocaine was epidemic. I think that it was something that the media, it became an exciting thing to talk about.
What you got? What you got? We call our broadcast 48 Hours on Crack Street.
Chicago was a state of crackdown, starting in this
Soon after our paper was published, within days we were getting calls from media all over the country and started hearing the term crack babies.
Spotlight tonight, our investigative series on cocaine kids.
Despite all the warnings, a growing number of babies are being born already addicted to cocaine.
As it got out into the world, it became this phenomenon.
23 babies were born to the cocaine-using women in this study.
Because the problem has appeared so suddenly, there are few reliable statistics.
The number of so-called cocaine babies is growing at an astonishing rate.
The number of babies born addicted has risen more than 500%.
I had lots of people interviewing me.
Dr. Ira Chasnoff of Chicago's Northwestern Memorial Hospital runs the oldest program researching cocaine in the newborn.
It appears that cocaine has just as devastating effect on pregnancy and the newborn as heroin.
Chasnoff told reporters that cocaine exposure was causing some babies to be born with brain damage, and that others were overwhelmed by even simple eye contact with the mother.
These children are not normal in the sense that they're going to be able to enter the classic schoolroom and function in large groups of children.
Other researchers and doctors echoed Chasnoff's conclusions, and a host of seemingly recognizable symptoms took hold.
One of the things that we see about babies who have been exposed to cocaine is they tend to be very tremulous and shaky, very fine kinds of tremors.
We looked to see if we would find the effects that were reported, and we were saying, well, we're not seeing this.
As Chasnoff's star rose, Dr. Claire Coles was reaching a different, though equally startling, conclusion about crack babies based on her study of infant behavior at Emory University.
The effects didn't seem consistent with the action of the drug itself. Many of the children who were the so-called classic cocaine babies were premature babies. And the symptoms that were seen on videos, on television, the tremoring arms and all that, that was prematurity. You could have taken any premature baby and gotten the same image. I think that people got very focused on cocaine is the cause of this, rather than thinking substance abuse is the cause of this, maternal lifestyle is the cause of this, social issues are the cause of this.
But Coles' findings didn't fit within the narrative of what had become a national scare.
Cocaine. Crack. If you use drugs while you're pregnant, your baby can die.
There's a whole lot of people who feel that if you can just scare people sufficiently about something, that's better than actually telling them the truth about something, because that'll prevent them from doing bad things.
The American agenda tonight poses this question. What would you do about pregnant women who use drugs and pass those drugs on to their babies?
By the late 1980s, Chasnoff's findings were being used to justify cases charging pregnant cocaine users as child abusers, drug dealers, and killers.
I was at first stunned, and then angry that they would distort the information. That's when I started realizing how a lot of this can be taken out of context and used to bolster any kind of argument.
People may have felt that they were doing the right thing, but I mean, the idea that one would prosecute a pregnant woman and use this kind of not very accurate research to do so is very disturbing.
As the prosecutions continued, crack babies grew to toddlers.
No one knows how many there are, or even how best to identify them. But educators suspect that tens of thousands of crack kids are in kindergartens in inner cities, in suburbia, even in small-town America.
It now threatens to create an entirely new underclass of children unable to care for themselves, of infants born to suffer.
In the United States this year, at least 100,000 crack babies will be born. Today, the government said it will cost $5 billion a year to care for such babies, and money doesn't begin to tell the whole story.
I'm supposed to be a victim of that crack era. I was supposed to be disruptive, mentally unstable. I wasn't supposed to reach the point where I am now. The initial hypothesis is that drug abuse would lead to huge physical deformities, huge mental deformities in children. And, you know, in myself, I didn't see any of those things. So it will be easy for me to believe that that science doesn't hold true.
Almost 3 decades since Chasnoff's initial research, which focused on just 23 babies, long-term studies have found only subtle changes in the brains of cocaine-exposed research subjects like Stone.
There's no particular evidence of this social emotional deficit. You're not seeing really broad-scale severe developmental problems as was predicted. The schools have not been overwhelmed by the flood of cocaine-exposed children.
In fact, Stone became the first in her family to graduate from college.
In learning that I had been exposed, I kind of told myself I'm not going to make this an issue. Whatever I have to do to get around what the effects may be, I'll do that.
The paper was a very preliminary kind of finding, and it really shouldn't have been generalized to the extent it was, which I believe that Dr. Chasnoff eventually came to himself and said that he felt that this didn't really represent the whole of the situation.
Doctor, let's go to you on this question. You studied this, perhaps one of the first people to study this. How does cocaine use affect newborns?
Well, there's no question that cocaine use during pregnancy has some real effects on the unborn and on the newborn child. But these effects are not devastating and can be addressed through treatment for the pregnant woman and for the child.
Over time, Chasnoff did distance himself from some of the extreme pronouncements he was quoted as making in the early days.
I probably talked too much or gave long-winded explanations which were completely cut out. It was one of those feelings where you just feel completely out of control.
But the hysteria that followed his initial research had already taken its toll.
It wasn't even a natural disaster or a war. It was a drug that caused so much harm among my generation and my parents' generation.
Certainly cocaine was contributing to this problem, but they got very focused on it as the only sole cause of it. I think people still believe the cocaine story, but alcohol is much more of a problem than cocaine. because there's much more alcohol used and it has much more severe effects. I think if you say something 3 times out loud, people take it as fact. And also, I think there are certain ideas that people want to believe that really fit in with cultural stereotypes, and it's hard to get rid of those.
So what happens, right? This scientific story gets questioned almost immediately, as you saw. Because there's no data to support the stories of crack babies and cocaine babies, the scientific evidence continues to point in other directions. So by 1995, right? So notice this is what, 9 years after the '86 Drug Abuse Act. By 1995. The U.S. Sentencing Commission is already recommending to reduce the disparities, citing scientific evidence that the difference between the 2 forms of cocaine isn't really significant. By the 2000s, what we have are a number of Supreme Court cases. The first one is Kimbrough versus the United States, where the Supreme Court rules that the sentencing guidelines are really guidelines, and they are going to have to be law. And so even though they recommend this disparity, courts don't have to follow that in sentencing people. More significantly, in 2010, under the Obama administration, the Fair Sentencing Act reduces the disparity, although it does not eliminate it. So we have the new disparity on the next slide. Sorry. So now there's a 5-year minimum for 500 grams of powder cocaine or 28 grams of crack cocaine, rather than 5, and a 10-year minimum for 200 grams of crack or 5,000 grams of powder. So it's still a significant disparity, but not nearly as significant as it was before.
That's still hellaciously big.
Yeah.
5,000 grams, I just did the math, and that's 11.253 pounds.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Like
So
a box like this.
Yes. There's no question if you have that much powder cocaine, you're probably intending to sell.
It's a happy sip of
yes.
that.
Do you know how those new numbers are come up? Do you know if that 18 to 1 was conceived, or why it was 18 to 1?
Actually, that's a great question. I don't know.
And the
I don't
100
know how
to
they
1.
decided at this particular ratio.
And the 100,
I don't know.
280 goes into 5,000 more than 100 times. Or maybe not.
No.
20 grams per pound, which is like a pretty regular standard measurement.
So, so what you have here, right, is still a discrepancy, but not as bad. And these adjustments are all made based on the new, sort of more rational kind of reflection on the science behind it. Although, right, the science is still telling us there's no difference between the 2 forms, powder and crack, but we still have a disparity. So you would know what the difference, the sort of main real difference between powder and crack cocaine has to do with the intensity of the high and the length that it lasts. So powder cocaine typically lasts longer, and it's a little less intense, and crack cocaine is a little shorter burst, but more intense. So, but in terms of the physiological effects, there's not a really big difference. Most of it has to do with the difference in how it's taken, rather than the actual chemical composition of the drug. So the next decision comes in 2012, year before last. Dorsey versus United States and Hill versus United States. The Supreme Court here's arguments about whether or not these new revised guidelines can be applied retroactively. And so what they determined is that yes, they can. And so what we have the beginnings of 2 years ago is at the federal level a redressing of these disparities, similar to what happened with the Rockefeller drug law repeal in the 1990s in New York State. So there appears to be a new sort of change in the weather, as it were, for drug policies. I want to quickly sort of, in reducing, making these changes, both the Sentencing Commission and the Supreme Court have cited the two sort of main things for our purposes here are fairness and desire to reduce racial disparities, which is a significant part, particularly for the Sentencing Commission. It explicitly mentioned the racial disparities. Although, if you recall from our discussions earlier in the term, the disparities alone do not account for the racial disparities in conviction rates. Blacks were convicted at much higher rates than for crack cocaine possession than their numbers would indicate as the percentage of users, right? So even once you controlled for the discrepancies, blacks were still being convicted more often in both forms than their usage would have led you to believe. The other thing, turn the mic on again. The other thing is the scientific evidence. So both of these were factors for the Sentencing Commission. Both are mentioned also by the Supreme Court in this decision. There, that's better. No feedback, and I don't have to shout. Also, the Supreme Court, in making the decision to have these applied retroactively, looked a lot at previous case law and precedent. So, although we have these interesting changes, right? There's in the 2000s there emerged another sort of drug scare around methamphetamine. And so in Oregon in 2008, for example, we had Measure 61, which did these things, among other things. It sort of increased, or created really, mandatory minimums for ecstasy, what are they, ecstasy, heroin, is that the other one, and meth, and cocaine. So it created a bunch of new mandatory minimums for different drug crimes, drug possession, or dealing. And one of the things about this measure is that it required that these sentences be served in their entirety before this time. Alternative incarceration measures would enable people to lower the length of their sentences, as did good behavior in prison. So these sentences could no longer be modified by those things after this measure.
Kill 20 kids. Get out early.
So one of the things, so probably doesn't get up as far as the sort of meth scare in the 2000s, but you all probably remember the meth scare in the 2000s in the media. What's your sense of how meth was covered in the 2000s in the media? Assuming you were watching the media in the last 15 years of your life. Yes?
It's like it was Montana started it with the faces of meth, and it would show people over time and how they're show their, I guess, probably different pictures of them being arrested, like different photos of them over however long, and just the changes.
Yeah, there was a big public anti-meth campaign that was launched about 10 years ago or so. And a big part of it were these bulletin boards and television ads. They would often focus on people who have lost teeth and whatnot, and sort of they're look prematurely aged as a result of meth use. There's another hand. Yeah. Yeah. Move out. Yes.
In Portland, there was used a lot of association with all the suburbs around Portland.
So. Yeah, so it's definitely associated with, as with previous drug scares, part of the concern arises as it becomes associated with a social underclass, right? Sort of poor, more suburban, more, I would even say rural perhaps, in the West, Western states. On the other hand, saw one. Yes.
Well, it's kind of happening right now with the new form of heroin, the crocodile. It's not as widespread now, but a year or two ago, it was pretty in the news about this new version of heroin that's interesting to fall off and for the same thing. I don't know the validity of those claims, but it still continues to happen.
I grew up on the East Coast by the Pennsylvania border, and my town, it was the thing with the underclass, the way it was publicized within my town was that like there were a lot of meth labs already blown up in a specific part of town, so those were like blown up in the media to be like these are the specific areas of town that were associated with specific groups of people that was advertised as like these are the groups who are using meth, whereas like the higher you got up, it was like the disparity of poverty.
Well, before coming here, because I'm from California, I heard that Springfield is the meth capital of the nation. Do you know if that's true?
It's not true.
It's not.
It was. It hasn't been for a really long time.
It was, yeah. At one point, it was the second in the nation.
Yep.
I think the big thing about the media then,
The Hells Angels.
not unlike the media of crack, is it was like very much, it was very much like a drug of poverty. So, not only were the images that were shown of people who were meth addicts in like wasn't it like meth or the amount of meth found in once, like the state campaign? Yeah, so not only was it sort of shown of like people who had been like repeat offenders, we'll say, but they were also shown of like very like dirty and historically like what we would I guess put into the stereotype of like trashy, and that was really how it was portrayed. It was like this was like meth is a very trashy drug, so it wasn't just like this is a way to cope with poverty. It's like this is what poor trashy white people do. At least like where I grew up, and largely in Oregon, that was like it was always like the hillbilly, like backwoods, trashy white families that did or were like accused of being meth addicts.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things with so there are a lot of things that sort of played into, and it very much was a rebranding of meth in the 2000s, because speed has been around since before I've been around. It was called speed, or it was called
Benz.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it was quite the same thing, but it had a lot of different names, and sort of. Meth is the most recent of those names. And in that rebranding, it got an association with danger, right? So there was really high publicized explosions of places where people were making meth. So that contributed to an association of it with danger. It was also very much just associated with sort of a kind of new idea of a lower class white population and Mexican, right? So there was like both of those associations I think are pretty common with sort of meth enforcement. It was also very much associated with sort of being highly, highly addictive, right? So much like crack, which was touted as more addictive than powder cocaine. Turns out less than 1 in 4 people who've ever tried crack cocaine used it again, right? So very addictive, but not as addictive as the hype sort of led people to believe. If you tried it once, you'd be addicted instantly. And that turned out not to be the case. Meth also was touted as sort of suddenly very, very addictive. Also, very associated with violence. So has anyone seen Orange is the New Black? So not to ruin it for those of you who haven't, but there's one character, Pennsatucky, right, who, I'm sorry. Someone commits a violent act, and it's attributed to their meth use, right? Because she's on meth, she commits this violent act, right? It's very much sort of, meth was very much linked with violence, just as cocaine was linked with violence in the 1980s and the 1930s. Marijuana was linked with violence in the 1930s. And there's this great passages in Provine's book where she has these descriptions of people describing people going on murderous rampages from one marijuana cigarette, right? Which is, I wonder how they stopped giggling long enough to do that. But, right, so each one of these drug scares uses the same sorts of associations. The drugs, sometimes there are new drugs, but they often are around for a very long time. What's new are the associations, right? People commit all kinds of violent crimes on all kinds of drugs, including alcohol and nicotine. But we don't always attribute their violent behavior to their alcohol or nicotine use. Or their OxyContin use. We attribute them, however, to their narcotics use, to their illegal narcotics use. That association becomes very strong and leads to then movements to criminalize those drugs further. Did you have a?
There was a class offered here years and years ago in the substance use prevention program, and it was called Meth, Ice, and Ecstasy. And it was a weekend seminar that I took, and I just remember learning that meth was, there was an epidemic here in Lake County in the early 80s where there was a meth that was made incorrectly. So basically, within this one summer, like 9 out of 10 emergency room visits and fires were attributed to this recipe. Apparently, somebody sold the recipe and changed it before they sold it or something. So there was something in the meth that was making people either go crazy, blow up, or kill themselves, kill people or kill themselves, or psychosis and consequences. So that is at the same time when meth was very late on it was like early or something like that. But it was interesting because I remember in the class they actually gave the recipe for meth in this class. Like they showed how to make it.
Wow.
They showed pictures of labs, but also like the formula for it was given in paper to us, which I think is very strange.
Yeah, well, I don't know how to make it, but I can't imagine that it's that hard, or else there wouldn't be so much of it. But apparently it was, yeah.
And I think that it's also been something that's been historically marked as a rural drug and use. And I think that part of the reason that it's such a scare and it is such a bad thing is that like crack, it's not expensive, it's very cheap. And so kids or young people can become addicted and consume it very easily. And dealers can afford to give it to them because it doesn't cost a lot of money.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about meth, and which explains partly its sort of rural associations as well, right, is that it is relatively easy to make, right, and relatively easy to find, and inexpensive in comparison to cocaine or heroin, right, which requires something that's imported from outside of the U.S. Right, marijuana also, right, it's very easy to acquire and less expensive, partly because it's so domestically available in the U.S. One of the interesting things that also happens in the 2000s is the banning of pseudoephedrine, right, as one of the sort of easy ingredients for it.
So when new drugs kind of surface on the market, do they need this like overhyped media hysteria to get like these preventive legislation measures passed?
Generally, yeah. There's interesting story. LSD is an interesting story. So LSD was around for quite a while before it was illegal. And sort of as it became illegal in the late 60s, you had in tandem an association of LSD with hippies and a sort of media scare about people committing murder on acid. There's the first episode of Dragnet, the sort of new Dragnet that premiered in the 70s, not the vintage Dragnet. The television show Dragnet, the first episode focused on hippies and LSD. And all the LSD users, not to ruin the episode for you, they all die from LSD overdose.
helter skelter.
So there's that constant sort of pattern. One of the things I think probing does well is sort of show how that pattern recurs with similar elements. Although not always racialized in the same way, right? The association with hippies and LSD was definitely a different kind of racialization with a particular segment of a white population. I think with meth you see something similar, where there's an association with particularly a white population that's racialized in a particular way, as a certain kind of white that's not acceptable.
Also, the media scares are more about, what little part of organization can we capitalize on to make a ton of money. It really has nothing to do with pushing legislative measures through. It has to do with what will sell advertising.
That's another important thing. So right, the two elements here, right, the media frenzy and the political moves are not necessarily working in tandem. But when they happen to coalesce, right? So one of the reasons why it's so hard at first to move against cocaine is that no one cares, right? It's in the patent medicines, the drug companies, the doctors are all against making it illegal. There's no sort of public concern over it. And so it's hard for the politicians who want to ban it and regulate it to really get that through. And it's not until a later period, piggybacking on the prohibition movement against alcohol, at that point there begins to be a media frenzy around black men and white women specifically, right, in the South. And that gets attributed to their cocaine use. Cocaine then reaches the status of a moral panic, and the politicians are right there ready to ban it, right? So you have to have both of those things come together. The media frenzy and the sort of political will to move against a particular drug. So what I'd like you to do, the time we have left, take out a piece of paper and just sort of free-write. What problems would you identify with current drug policies? Don't worry about solutions yet. Just think about things you think are wrong with drug policy, whether you think should be different. Take that in whatever direction you want. State, federal,